The fire came in the middle of the night. It didn't announce itself with drama or warning, only a quiet crackle at first, like dry leaves being stepped on. By the time Daniel smelled smoke, the ceiling above their bed was already glowing a faint, ominous orange. He shook Miriam awake, his voice tight and hoarse with a fear he didn't yet understand. Within minutes, they were barefoot on the street, wrapped in borrowed blankets, watching everything they had ever worked for collapse into ash. The house burned fast, consuming their past with a terrifying hunger. Their wedding photos, filled with smiles and promises, curled into black petals. The comfortable couch Daniel had bought after his first big promotion, a symbol of their early success, simply vanished into the flames. Miriam's small sewing room, the place where she dreamed of one day opening her own tailoring shop, was reduced to nothing more than soot and a puddle of melted needles. When the pale light of dawn finally broke through the smoke, all that remained was a skeletal frame of walls and a silence that was far too heavy to break. It felt as though they had lost everything that night, or so it seemed. The weeks that followed were harder, in many ways, than the fire itself. At first, there was an outpouring of sympathy. People brought food, clothes, and soft, comforting words. But life, relentless and unforgiving, doesn't pause for grief. The bills began to arrive, addressed to a home that no longer existed. Their temporary housing arrangement came to an end. The insurance claims, tangled in red tape, stalled and went unanswered. Friends who once laughed with them at dinner parties now grew awkward, their conversations strained. They didn't know what to say to a couple whose future had so completely burned away. Daniel retreated into himself. He stopped talking much, the silence a wall he built around his despair. Miriam tried to stay strong for both of them, but strength is a heavy burden when it is carried alone. At night, she would cry quietly into her pillow, careful not to let Daniel hear. During the day, Daniel would just stare at his hands, these hands that had once built a life, now holding nothing but empty space. He wondered what they were good for anymore. The strain began to show. They argued more than they ever had in all their years together. The fights were about money, about blame, about tiny, insignificant things that were never really tiny at all. They were about missed words, tired tones, and the unspoken fears that haunted their every waking moment. Once, in a moment of pure exhaustion and defeat, Daniel looked at her and said, "Maybe we were foolish. Maybe we were foolish to ever believe we could have more." Miriam didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, her eyes filled not with anger, but with a question that hurt more than any accusation could. If we stop believing, what do we have left? That question hung in the air between them, a silent challenge to the darkness that had enveloped their lives. One evening, after another long day of rejection and disappointment, they sat on the cold floor of their small, rented room. The electricity was out, a casualty of a bill they couldn't afford to pay. Dinner was a shared loaf of bread and the familiar, oppressive silence. It was Miriam who broke it. "We still have each other," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the gloom. Daniel let out a long, weary sigh. "Love doesn't pay the rent, Miriam." "No," she replied, her voice gaining a sliver of its old firmness. "But it keeps us standing long enough to try again." Her words didn't magically fix their problems. They didn't pay the bills or rebuild their home. They did something much harder and much more important. They reminded Daniel of who they were before life became comfortable, before success felt like a guarantee. They reminded him of the two young people who fell in love with nothing but dreams in their pockets, before loss had made fear so much louder than hope. That night, huddled together for warmth on the floor, they made a decision. They would stop waiting. They would stop waiting for an insurance check, for a helping hand, for life to somehow restore what they had lost. They would build again with whatever they had left. And what they had left, they realized, was each other. The next day, the change began. Daniel started finding small jobs. It was manual work, repairs, anything that paid, no matter how little. His hands, once soft from office work, grew rough and calloused, but with each blister, a piece of his pride slowly returned. He was providing again. Miriam, meanwhile, borrowed an old, rickety sewing machine from a kind neighbor. It rattled loudly and jammed often, but it worked. She began sewing for people in the area, hemming trousers, repairing torn dresses, altering wedding outfits for young couples who reminded her of herself. She charged very little at first, just enough to buy more thread. But word of her skill spread. People noticed her careful, meticulous stitches. They saw the way she treated their old, worn clothes as if they were precious treasures that mattered. Daniel started helping her in the evenings after his own long days. He would cut fabric, deliver the finished pieces on foot, and slowly he started learning to smile again when he saw the gratitude on their neighbors' faces. They failed often. Some weeks they earned barely enough to buy groceries. Some days the weight of their struggle felt unbearable, and they wondered if they were just being foolish to keep trying against such odds. But something fundamental had changed within them. Failure no longer felt like a final ending. It just felt like a step, another lesson learned. They weren't just rebuilding a house anymore. They were rebuilding themselves from the ground up. Years passed quietly, marked not by grand events, but by small, steady progress. The tailoring business grew. Daniel, surprisingly, discovered he had a knack for numbers and took over the bookkeeping. They saved slowly, sometimes painfully, not for luxury, not for a fancy car or a big house, but for stability, for the peace of mind that comes from knowing you can weather the next storm. The day they finally rented a small, dedicated shop space for the business, Miriam cried as she turned the key in the lock. It wasn't grand, the paint was peeling and the floors were worn. But it was theirs. It was a testament to every stitch she had sewn, every late night they had worked. One afternoon, Daniel came home carrying a small, rectangular object wrapped in a cloth. He had brought a framed photograph, one of the very few things he had managed to salvage from the ruins of their old house. The edges of the frame were charred black, and the faces in the photo were faded and smoky. But you could still see them to young, hopeful people smiling on their wedding day. They hung it on the shop wall. It wasn't there as a sad reminder of what they had lost. It was a reminder of what they had survived. On the day they finally moved into their new home, it was smaller than the one they'd lost, but it felt infinitely warmer in spirit. Daniel stood at the doorway, looking at the simple rooms, and whispered, "We're back." Miriam, standing beside him, shook her head gently. "No," she said, taking his hand. "We're better because losing everything had taught them a lesson that success never could. It taught them that love is not proven in times of abundance, but in its quiet endurance through hardship. It taught them that faith isn't a loud declaration when life is easy, but a stubborn, persistent whisper when it is hard. And it taught them that some people are not broken by loss, they are revealed by it. They didn't just rebuild the life they once had, they built a new one, a stronger one. One forged in fire and bound together forever.